What is going on with Kansas basketball? They're not really struggling a whole lot, but to Kansas basketball standards, they are. Is it a result of the Big 12 just being so good? Is it a result of Kansas not having enough talent? We'll talk about all that here today on the 10 of 12 podcast. Welcome in here. Scott Chasen is standing by from fog.net. He's going to be talking KU basketball as well as some Big 12 basketball discussion towards the end of the show. Real quick here, be sure to follow us on Twitter at 10 of 12 podcast. I'd appreciate that very much. You can stay up to date with everything going on around the Big 12. The latest updates, news, predictions, scores, highlights, everything is there on Twitter at 10 of 12 podcast. But without further ado, let's bring in Scott Chasen from fog.net. Scott, how's it going today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for taking time with me, man. Are you a Chiefs fan? Or are you just kind of a neutral NFL fan? Where do you stand on that?
I'm a Chiefs fan. I grew up going to games. We've had season tickets in my family since like the 70s, and
Gotcha.
I lived in Oklahoma. That's where I was raised. But yeah, I grew up a big Chiefs fan.
Gotcha, man. I love following you on Twitter. I think the best part of following you is your analytics and your what game theory. All the coaches' decisions they do right or they do wrong. I'm always happy to see what you have to say about them, man.
Yeah, some would disagree with you. Some would say I tweet a little bit too much about that.
No, man,
I
come
think
on.
that might be fair. But,
well, I took a sports econ class last year, and there's like a section of all about that stuff and going for 2 down 14 and all that stuff. So I always enjoy that. But we're here to talk KU basketball. No football today. Heck of a win for those Chiefs, though, if I must say so myself. But KU basketball will be the topic of discussion here. So let's just go right into it here, man. What's going on with KU basketball? Obviously, the Big 12 is loaded. We all know that. Baylor's a heck of a team. You don't have that leader on your team. Is that the biggest issue for Kansas, not having a leader?
I think it's a combination of a lot of things. For starters, if the scheduling had worked out a little differently and Kansas had played the games it was supposed to play, Kansas wouldn't have lost 3 in a row. Kansas probably wouldn't have even lost 3 out of 4 because they would have played Iowa State, who Kansas State fans will also know Iowa State is not a very good team this year at Allen Fieldhouse, and Kansas would have stomped them. And then coming off that game, I have to imagine they would have beat OU. But there are legitimate problems for Kansas. I think one of them is not having necessarily that guy. But there have been past Kansas teams that didn't have that guy in terms of maybe a vocal leader who was also leading by example, and they've found ways to play well. I think it's a combination of inconsistent play from guys that you thought maybe you could count on early in the year. I think the up and down play of David McCormick. I think this team working in a lot of new pieces, and then also acknowledging, you don't get to claim a national championship for last year, although I think Kansas should hang a banner just because I think one of the programs is hanging a banner for being ranked number 4 at the end of the year. And so if they're doing that, then you can hang whatever you want. But this is it's a rebuilding year. Kansas doesn't really have those. I mean, usually those years are, 2 seed, 3 seed, 4 seed, but that's what this feels like. This feels like a year coming off a Final Four or a national title where you lose 2 All-Americans to the NBA and you lose another key senior. And okay, now it's time to rebuild, and you have a good top 25 team, but not a top 10 team. And that's what this feels like. I think it feels a little bit more like the sky is falling in Lawrence because the tournament didn't happen last year, and you didn't, get the team that was going to be the number 1 overall seed. That team didn't get a chance to go to the Final Four and then, rebuild from that. You're really rebuilding from nothing. You're rebuilding from an incomplete season. So I think there are some problems. I think there are some solutions, maybe some coming sooner than we think. But what I think you have is a Kansas team that is good, but not great, is up there with the Texas Techs of the world, but probably not up there with the Baylors of the world.
I was watching that game against Oklahoma on Saturday, and Fran Fraschilla was harping on Marcus Garrett having to be, he had to be the pilot. He had to hand out the peanuts. He has to, fly the plane, get the bags all handled. Do you think that Garrett needs to step up more, or is it someone else needs to step up and complement him and be dual leader, so to speak?
Well, if Bill Self is to be believed, Bill Self thinks it's an everyone else issue, basically. And he kind of put it on said it on I can't remember if it was a media availability or a radio show or something, but he said a little while back, basically that Marcus Garrett in the past has been the Robin to someone else's Batman in terms of ball handling. Let's not forget Marcus Garrett led the Big 12 in assist to turnover ratio, and was the best defender in the country a year ago. So he's obviously a very good player. But this year he doesn't have a Robin in terms of ball handling. He's the Batman. And the other players he plays alongside, Christian Brown, Ochai Agbaji, Jalen Wilson, these guys don't really handle the ball. And the one guy who does and who could take some pressure off him in DeJuan Harris isn't a shooter, and Garrett isn't a shooter. And if you play a big man who isn't a shooter, now all of a sudden you just have a lineup that, could set basketball back 50 years in terms of floor spacing. So I think there's been a lot that's been put on him. I think he at times hasn't played well, at times had turnover issues, at times hasn't maybe had the impact he's used to having defensively. But I think a lot of that is because he has to do just about everything, because other guys on the team have been really inconsistent. And, Christian Brown is kind of the shining example of this. Christian Brown has 8 games this year, shooting, I believe, 44% from 3 or better, 8 games. Well, he also has 7 games this year, shooting 25% or worse from 3. So there's really been no middle ground. It's been he plays terrific or he shoots horribly, and sometimes in those games he doesn't contribute in other ways. Jalen Wilson has been the same way. Jalen Wilson was Kansas's best player for a month and a half. And then you look at recent games, the first meeting with OU, he has 7 turnovers. The most recent meeting with OU, he has 3 turnovers and a ton of defensive mistakes. In between those 2 games, he shoots 2 for 7 and then shoots 2 for 7 again. So it's been a lot of inconsistent play around him, and I think that's made it hard on Garrett. Garrett hasn't had the big man in the paint like Udoka Azubuike to be able to throw it to. And then, his limitations are still his limitations. He's a good, not great athlete. He doesn't shoot the ball well, and he's tough. He wants to play a lot of minutes, but if he plays 38 minutes, he's not going to be the same intense defender, facilitator on the other end, driver getting to the rim. I think it's a tough situation for him to be in, mostly because they don't have that, at least to this point, that second ball handler who's shown an ability to play next to Garrett and contribute without hurting the offense because of the lack of spacing threat.
Let's go back to, was it November when they played Gonzaga? Do you think this team has, I wouldn't say declined, but I would say, have they declined since then? Or has the Big 12 just been so tough that they're not able to progress anymore and they've kind of just flattened out at this point in time?
Probably both. It's probably a plateau that looks like a decline because of what you just said. How ridiculous the schedule is. But, normally Bill Self teams get better around this time of the year, but they hit there's usually the January lull is not uncommon. When they won the national championship, they lost 2 of 3. When they were the number 1 overall seed, I believe in 2015-16, they lost 3 of 5. When they were a number 1 seed with Ben McLemore in 2012-2013, they lost 3 in a row. Yeah. And one of those was to a horrible TCU team that prompted the Bill Self Topeka YMCA could have beat Kansas comments. And those teams were all, I believe, 1 seed. And even the Elite 8 or the Final Four team with Devontae Graham, that team lost back-to-back games. That team had a lull. That team lost at home to Oklahoma State. I think that team lost like 3 home games that year. And they had a team meeting or a really awkward kind of, I think it was an alumni event where, Bill Self sort of chewed out the team in front of all these guys coming back. And that was one where it felt like the sky was falling too. So this is not, totally abnormal for them to hit a stretch like this and then find some fix or solution. I think what's different is back at the beginning of the year, you had Jalen Wilson playing really, really well, and defensives have kind of adjusted to that. Some people want to say they're not playing 5 guards anymore. They don't put him at the center spot. Well, the last time KU's 5-guard lineup outscored someone in a game when it was on the court versus the opponent was against North Dakota State. And that includes 3 games where they've spent double digits using that 5-guard approach. There are some things it does well, but there are some things it flat out hasn't done well. And people, on Twitter and stuff seem to think that's the fix. Just play 5 guards, get rid of the big man. Well, they tried it against Texas Tech. It didn't work. They tried it against Texas. It didn't work. They tried it in the last game. It didn't work. At a certain point, you've got all these ingredients. You just have to find the right way to put them together. I think Bill Self's going to mix up the lineup this week. I think the next game will have new starters, probably plural. But Yeah, I mean, I think they've kind of flattened just because the conference is tough. Guys like Jalen Wilson aren't playing as well as they had been, and David McCormick had a little bit of a hot streak for 3 games, and even he's kind of dropped right back off, and teams have started guarding him a little differently. So there's a lot of stuff they're still trying to figure out. I don't know all the answers yet. I don't think Bill Self does either, but it does feel a little bit different just from the perspective of maybe the talent level is a little bit down this year. So maybe they can't, maybe they won't be able to kind of put things together and have a great ending like Bill Self kind of alluded to. He basically said the storybook season is over. That's not happening, but a storybook ending is still possible. That's kind of his, I guess, phrase or mantra coming off this most recent game. Maybe they don't have the talent level for that. I don't know, but I think they're going to try some unorthodox things and mix it up this week.
Talking about, sort of a 5-guard lineup, I haven't seen every KU game this year, so I don't know what I'm really talking about here. But with McCormick in there going up against, Brady Manick or whoever it was down low for Oklahoma, he was scoring, especially to start off that second half, and then they kind of went away from that, and Oklahoma started playing well. So I know you kind of answered this here, but would you rather them go 5-guard or not? I think McCormick is, like you've said, he's been hot and cold. Some of my friends, we joke about whenever he touches the ball, you're just like, oh boy, what's he going to do here? Is he going to throw it off the backboard? So are you a fan of him being on the court or not?
I think it probably has to be a happy medium between the two. Against OU, they decided they were going to play 5 guards when Brady Manick was at the 5 because they didn't want David McCormick having to chase Brady Manick around on the perimeter and guard the 3-point line like that. They thought, in the first meeting, Brady Manick didn't play, so he was able to guard Kuaith, or however you say his name, and McCormick just dominated that matchup. He didn't get a bunch of rebounds because of how OU's offense operated. It pulled him out to the perimeter, especially defensively, but he scored 17 points. I think he had 3 blocks in that game, and his points were, give me the ball in the block. I'm going to back you down, basically, because I'm stronger than you, I'm bigger than you, and I'm going to score over the top of you. He had 3 really good games, scored 17 plus points, and then Baylor, I've kind of joked about this too. Like, David McCormick faced what I called the Twitter defense for 3 straight games, which was, people on social media dogging him and saying he's not very good and he's a worthless player and all this stuff. So what happens, teams don't respect him. They guard him one-on-one. They don't send help. And David McCormick is too good of a basketball player to not send help. You don't do that. He scored 22 points against Oklahoma State. He scored 17 against Oklahoma. I can't remember I think the TCU game was the other game in that stretch. He absolutely dominated that game on both ends and made life miserable for Kevin Samuel on the, on the TCU side of things. And then Baylor said, okay, you're a decent player. We're going to send a double team at you. And immediately that it looked like it bothered him. It forced him into turnovers and mistakes. It made him look sped up and shaky. He committed fouls on the other end. And so I think when teams do actually respect, hey, this guy can hurt us if we don't account for him, that makes it harder to keep David McCormick on the court because he hasn't shown the adjustment in his game to know how to deal with those double teams and know what to do when teams are attacking him that way. I think it's unrealistic for Kansas to play more than maybe 20 minutes of 5-guard basketball a game because I think you're going to wear down your wings when you do that. Jalen Wilson and Tristan and Aruna, it takes a toll on their bodies to have to play the 5 and rebound and battle like that, especially with Jalen Wilson, who's going to be the guy most of the time. So I think it handcuffs maybe the amount of time you can play it. It caps it. That's the word I'm looking for. It caps it at probably 20, maybe 25 minutes a game, maybe more situationally. But I think the answer is McCormick has to be good enough. And he has to develop and get better at the things he's not doing for the other 15, 20 minutes because, Mitch Lightfoot is a fine player, but the Jayhawks got outscored by 8 points with Mitch Lightfoot on the court against Oklahoma. And he had mistakes defensively. He lost Brady Manick on 1 3-point shot. He does some good things, but he's a matchup-based player at this point. You don't want to be relying on Mitch Lightfoot for 15 minutes, 20 minutes to hold down that 5 spot. I think the better options are 5-guard basketball or McCormick. So anyway, long answer, but I think the answer is both. I think the answer is they need McCormick to play better, and they need the 5-guard lineup to probably hold its own for significant stretches, or, it's going to be really hard for this KU team to get a lot better.
You led me right into my next point with Mitch Lightfoot. I go back 3 or 4 years ago, looking when he was a senior, you're thinking he's going to get 30, maybe 35 minutes a game. That just never happened. He never progressed. What happened with Mitch Lightfoot? And why did he – I really want to know, why did he redshirt last season? I still don't get that one.
Yeah. Well, I think they knew with Udoka coming back and David McCormick that Mitch Lightfoot was basically never going to see the floor. So I think it made sense at the time to say, hey, this guy's got a great chance to start. Maybe it'll be at the 4, whatever. And I think Mitch Lightfoot's game has come along a little bit. But the thing is about him, he has things he does really, really well. He takes charges at an elite level nationally, I would say. He's a terrific weak side rim protector in terms of shot blocking. Now, that doesn't mean I wouldn't call him a great shot blocker, because he's not the kind of guy to wall you up in the post and block your shot, but he'll come over from the weak side and block a shot, which is a really important trait. I think, guys like Tyson Chandler in the NBA, I mean, that it's just such an important and valuable tool. And then when you combine it, obviously, with good one-on-one defense, that takes you to the next level. But, he's good. He's good at what he's good at. He's an energy guy. He has the right attitude. He's a good practice player. The right attitude. He says the right things. I think there's value to having him around, but I think at a certain point you are who you are. And, his shooting, his 3-point shot never really developed enough to make that a weapon. His interior game is okay, but he's not a good enough interior scorer to be, your first, second, or third option on the court. He makes a lot of high IQ plays, but he's also been out of position defensively a lot of times this year. He doesn't rebound well enough, especially on the defensive glass. He's had a number of games where he's played double-digit minutes and had 0 or 1 rebound on the defensive glass. So, I just think he is who he is. I think he's improved in some ways. He's kind of stuck around, and you know what? He could come back for a 6th year if he so chooses next year. I don't know if he will or won't, but yeah, I mean, it's kind of a tough fit. It's also a little hard for him too, because to me, he reads as a 4-man. And basketball, and Bill Self basketball especially, has largely just kind of, wiped away the 4-man. That position really doesn't exist anymore unless you are an elite 4-man. I mean, West Virginia struggled to play Derek Culver with Oscar Tshiebwe together, and that's like the best situation you could ever have in terms of a front court. So I think that's part of it too. He's a little too small to play the 5. He doesn't have the strength and rebounding, and then, his weaknesses are his weaknesses, and I'm not sure how many of those, there's much time for him to get that much better at.
Let's jump to another player, Christian Brown. Personally, I don't know how high his ceiling can get in the Big 12. Am I wrong?
No, he's a great player, and he has the potential to be a really special player. But right now, he's just been so inconsistent. And, it's crazy to think half his games have been good and half his games have been bad. But, it's really as simple as that. Like, you can usually tell by his first 2 or 3 shots, is he going to be good or bad? Because, I think he went 0 of 5 and 0 of 3 from 3 last game. And he's had a number of games where he's like 1 of 5, 1 of 6, 0 of 4, something like that from 3-point range. And it's just a kind of rough all around performance. For him, the thing he can do right now is contribute on the glass. He's a great rebounder, very good athlete, very smart player, obviously. But using his athleticism is really important. Defensively is probably the area that will determine how much he plays and if he's one of the guys who actually leads the starting lineup, because against Oklahoma, he had a pretty horrible defensive game where at one point, it's maybe forgivable if a guy gets back cut, he loses sight of his man, that guy cuts behind him and gets to the rim. Christian Brown, I don't even know if there's a term for this. The guy went to back cut, but he was so far out of position, the guy actually cut right in front of his face and he didn't notice it. His man just walked right in front of him straight to the rim for what would have been a wide open layup, but someone rotated over and blocked the shot. And he reacted, but way too late. So clearly they weren't in zone or anything, because when he noticed it, he immediately tried to correct his mistake. But he let this guy just walk right in front of him, basically go to the rim. And, it's defensive mistakes like that I think are kind of driving Bill Self crazy right now, because this is a KU team that very early in the season showed the potential to be great on that end. And when, you have a guy like Brown who's been so up and down shooting the ball, what you need is consistency in some area. Are you rebounding? Are you defending? Are you guarding? Are you talking? Are you communicating? And I think that's the next step for him, is doing all of those things at a consistent level. And so that way, maybe it's a little bit more palatable when he isn't shooting the ball well, because Right now he's had a good year, I would say, but it's been an up and down year. And I think KU would like a little more consistency there.
Scott Chasen talking with us here on the 10 of 12 podcast. We'll be right back here after a quick break. We'll be continuing to talk about some KU basketball as well as some Big 12 hoops. We'll be right back. Welcome back in here to the 10 of 12 podcast. I am your host, Ryan Gilbert. Scott Chasen from thefog.net is joining us here. Scott, we'll start off with this here. You mentioned it earlier with the talent from Kansas. And I don't know if you remember this from, I think it was Jeff Goodman, who tweeted about Kansas essentially not having enough talent, or I guess not the talent that Coach Self is used to having at Kansas, right? Do you agree with that statement or not, man? Is that fair to say?
I think from a perspective, I do think it's fair. I think it's always been fair because, there have been Kansas teams that have played well without the quote unquote Kansas talent. Usually they have one guy though that kind of emerges and shows, like the team I think of with that, like the Devontae Graham, Svi Mikhailuk, LeGerald Vick, Malik Newman, Udoka Azubuike team that went to the Final Four. Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say Malik Newman was a 5-star recruit. He was, but he went to another place and then he transferred, because it didn't work out. That team didn't necessarily have, blue chip talent that, just all these 5 stars and whatever, but it kind of came together. The Ben McLemore team would be another example of that. Ben McLemore was a guy that, when he committed to KU, he was, or when he got offered by KU, I can't quite remember, but I'm pretty sure he was, playing center for his high school, and he was a backup on his own AAU team, and he redshirts his first year. And again, there are some good players on that roster, certainly, but you're talking about him starting next to Travis Relaford and Jeff Withey, another guy who, didn't work out somewhere else and joined the KU program. Kevin Young, another transfer. And that team turned it on and got pretty good. So I agree with Jeff Goodman from the perspective of this is not one of Bill Self's most talented teams. But I would also counter that and say, arguably one of his most talented teams was the Devon Dotson, Quentin Grimes, Dedrick Lawson that season, which had, in the recruiting class, 3 McDonald's All-Americans and Dotson, Grimes, and David McCormick. It had Doak for a little bit, had LeGerald Vick, Ochai Agbaji, whatever. That team had some talent, and that team was arguably Bill Self's worst team that he's had, coaching Kansas. So sometimes I think talent level is a little bit overrated, but I do think that's something that's missing from this year's team would be that guy. And maybe there were some signs Bryce Thompson could become that defensively. His offensive game hasn't come around, but he's had Bill Self's trust defensively, which is impressive for a 5-star recruit known mostly for his shooting. But, he took a bad fall. He took him a little bit of time to come back from injury. He comes back, and then what happens in the first game back? He breaks one of his fingers, and now he's out a little bit more time. So I think this team is down on talent from some of the Bill Self teams. I don't think that has to be a death sentence per se, but it requires a lot of other things going well. And I think in part not having guys playing turned up, as Bill Self likes to say, that can't happen. If you don't have the talent, you have to have, that much more from a buy-in perspective. And I think that's where they're trying to get to right now.
Before we go to Big 12 basketball, real quick, let's talk about the saga of the investigation going on with the NCAA. What's the latest on that, or even, is there anything as of late to report on?
Yeah, the latest is there is no latest, and it's just going to be kind of the secretive process until it isn't. KU's in the kind of independent review process that the NCAA has kind of mounted. We don't really know what that's going to look like. We don't know how it's going to go. Someone said after the last game, they said, Kansas should just declare themselves ineligible for the postseason this year and see if that, kind of sneaks by the NCAA as punishment. To which I responded, but I would expand on it, say that's not going to happen because Kansas's stance is Kansas hasn't done anything wrong. And, Kansas did things that other programs do. And, they're fighting basically all charges. And, it's interesting, I won't bore anyone. The important details of the case are basically that, there is wrongdoing with essentially, or alleged, I guess, with, Adidas and prospects. And, there seems to be some cadence to that. Kansas is saying, hey, it's not Kansas's job to monitor Adidas. And, they actually have some decent points I read through gosh, at least dozens. I'm sure it was more than 100. I can't remember how long it was now, but pages and pages of casework. And one of the things mentioned in there was Mike Bray, the coach at Notre Dame, who, pretty good reputation. He's quoted at one point of saying, what Kansas is doing is what every coach is doing. These conversations are legal and they're not asking for wrongdoing to happen, but that, maybe these executives or people at apparel companies are taking it the extra step. I don't know. I'm sure if you're a Kansas State fan listening to this, you think that's the most, bogus homerism, whatever. And if you're a Kansas fan, you're probably thinking, yeah, hey, maybe, another coach is saying this, whatever. I don't know how it's going to go. I honestly have no idea, but Kansas is fighting tooth and nail. And, eventually there will be an answer. Seems like this process has been slowed by the pandemic. It's kind of, I think, made the timeline drag out a little bit longer, but eventually we'll get some kind of an answer. We'll read through some kind of a ruling. We'll see how the NCAA or how the IARP rules with regard to Kansas. And, we'll get to cover that and write about it and see where things go from there.
What is the likely outcome? Is it a loss of scholarships or a tournament suspension or revoke of wins? What's the worst that can happen?
Yeah, well, I think there are 5 level 1 charges or allegations or however you want to say it. So those are the most severe. So if the IARP comes back and says, you know what, those are all valid, then I would guess a lot of trouble. I would guess scholarship reduction, postseason ban, maybe a show cause of some kind. I don't think that would be necessarily off the table, but there's also a world where they come back and they buy Kansas's argument and they say, nope, you're off the hook. I mean, it seems like there really is not much of a middle ground because of the way Kansas has argued this case, which is basically deny, refute. I think Bill Self has, I don't know if the word malicious has been used but he's basically said that like the NCAA is trying to force something and, feels like it has to go after someone and, they haven't used the word fabricated, but it's essentially kind of like forced a case. So, I mean, it could be pretty severe if the IARP comes back and says, nope, you were, guilty on all fronts. I would expect there to be some pretty harsh punishments. If they come back and they, side with Kansas, then I would expect it to not be too terrible. Now, Kansas does have a couple lower, like much lower level football violations that were alleged, just some things with like an assistant who might've been working with players when he wasn't able to, or before he was promoted at a certain point. That's part of it. Last I heard, I think Kansas was trying to separate those two things and even just say, hey, rule on the football stuff. We don't care, whatever. I don't know the latest on that, but that's another part of it too. So I'm curious, but I wouldn't expect anything much to come with the football program.
I'm just upset with they didn't have Late Night at the Fog this year. That would have been whoever the guest would have been there. That would have been fun. But we'll switch gears here, talk about some Big 12 basketball just in general here. Scott, what's been the biggest surprise to you so far? I guess what team could be a bad team like K-State, Iowa State, who's really struggling, or a team like Baylor. I guess there's no surprise with Baylor, but maybe Texas kind of shocked some people. What's the biggest surprise to you?
I mean, I don't think there's necessarily been a huge surprise. I think OU is worse than I thought OU was going to be. I really like their guards, really liked Harmon, really like Reeves, really like Manick. They really haven't materialized the way I thought they were going to. Texas Tech's probably been a little bit better just working in their transfers and pieces. I thought that was going to be a little bit of a struggle. It really hasn't been. And I think that's a good win that Kansas went to Texas Tech and beat them. Mm-hmm. Oklahoma State's been a little bit better than I thought they would be, especially with their departures. Obviously, Cade Cunningham is a huge part of that, but they hung with Baylor, even with Cunningham not playing in that game, which, by the way, was such a weird situation with, apparently it being a COVID situation, but he could still be there. I never followed up on that, but that was just
yeah.
That was very weird. Texas is better than I thought they would be, but I also picked Texas, I believe, third preseason. I'm trying to think back to my ballot. I think for the most part, there are a lot of really good Big 12 teams. The Big 12 is loaded. This is the best the conference has ever been. This Kansas team, and people may think this is hyperbole, but it's really not. This Kansas team would have won the Big 12 in other years, and it may not finish. I mean, it may finish fifth this year. Mm-hmm. Like, I think that should tell you how good the Big 12 is, because Baylor is generationally good. I would have loved to see this year's Baylor team play last year's Kansas team. I honestly think this year's Baylor team is better. And last year's Kansas team was undisputed the best team in college basketball. I think Baylor's better, and I would love to see Gonzaga play that team because that would be, that would be incredible to watch. I think Texas is really, really good, has a lot of veterans. I think Shaka Smart reportedly tested positive for COVID today, so obviously hope he's okay.
Yep.
But I like Greg Brown too. I thought that was a big addition for them at the time. Tech is obviously very, very good. West Virginia has kind of underperformed a little bit, but even they look to be figuring it out a little bit. The Big 12 is just loaded. There are basically 7 great, good plus teams in the Big 12, probably 3-ish great teams, and then maybe a couple in the tier after that. But the conference is loaded, and it has real quality depth, I think, this year.
I feel embarrassed to say this, man. I just pulled this up. I had Texas at number 6 in my preseason Big 12 poll, so that was not good, man.
It's not terrible. It's not terrible
Yeah.
because if you think about it, like you could have said West Virginia was better than them. West Virginia looked amazing on paper.
Yep.
Kansas, Baylor, obviously. You could have had, I'm forgetting an obvious one, Texas. Or no, we're talking about Texas. You could have had Texas Tech.
Yes.
That was the one I was thinking.
Yeah.
Who was the 5th team you had?
I had Oklahoma State at the 5 spot. Yeah.
Well, Cade Cunningham, the best player in the conference, arguably. So, who can even hate on that? Although I guess Jared Butler has kind of taken that one over.
I saw Cade Cunningham here in Manhattan get outscored by a walk-on for K-State, so I don't want to hear any of that. I think there'd be a little remiss if we didn't talk about K-State here for the listeners on Go Powercat. What have your initial takeaways been from that team? You're going to struggle when you only have one returning upperclassman, of course, but it's been bad. It's gone from bad to worse lately in Manhattan. What have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, I've actually checked out a few Kansas State teams or Kansas State games, including the most recent game against West Virginia, which that to me was the most discouraging game I've seen this year. I've been impressed at times, with certain guys like McGurl or Pack, or I've done things that I've been like, oh, that's impressive. I like the way they're playing. I like some of their young guys. I think Davion Bradford has the chance to be a pretty good player, but that to me was a discouraging one because that looked like West Virginia was not even interested in being in that game. They had multiple technical fouls. I mean, it got like bizarrely chippy at one point, and yet it was still just like a complete dominant game. And honestly, that to me would be the most troubling game this year. I know a lot of people would point to early in the year where they lost to the Fort Hays State game, which I did watch, and I honestly believe Fort Hays State was the better team that day. I think Kansas State played hard. I just think they got beat by a team that played its A+ game, and Kansas State didn't have it that day.
Yeah.
But I mean, they've been okay. They've hung in some games. They've competed. I don't think we'll know until probably next year. I feel, I told Fitz this, and it's funny. I feel about Kansas State this year the same way I do about Kansas football this most recent year, which if you're a Kansas State fan, I'm sorry. I'm sure that comparison is not what you wanted to hear. But by that, I mean, you can't evaluate, hardly anything basically for another year. Like you've got to give it a chance. And this Kansas State team, I don't think ever really had a fair chance to be up there competing with the other teams just because, the offseason departures, new team, new faces, all these new guys coming in, and then also the COVID stuff and the pandemic, and, it's not going to be the same. And so, I think we'll see what Kansas State is next year. We'll see what they are the year after that. Bruce Weber's had some great moments of that program. He kind of backdoored his way into Elite Eight, but he had to win a legitimate game against Kentucky to get there. And Dean Wade was injured. So, I don't think you can just take that away just because they got to play a 16 seed in the second round. He's had some really good moments. He's won, I think, 2 Big 12s, right? He's tied for the lead twice. That's really impressive.
Yeah.
I know some people want him out.
Came to Manhattan that's done that.
Yeah.
Besides Bill Self, of course. But yeah, go on.
No, I know some people are frustrated with him and want this to be the end of his tenure. This is who he is. This is you're seeing a rebuilding year in Kansas and it doesn't look great there. And this is very much a rebuilding year in Kansas State and it doesn't look great. So I don't know. I think we'll learn a lot about Bruce Weber the next 2 years. And that'll probably be the determining, whatever on if he's the Kansas State coach in 2 years. What does the team look like? And is this the group that is going to be that next, group of K-State young players to come together and, mature over years? I just wouldn't give up on them yet. I think they've been really bad. They've been worse than I thought they were going to be, probably by far, but I'm also a little bit more understanding of the set of circumstances that got them to this point. And I wouldn't be bailing just yet.
I'm with you, man. You bring up a lot of good points. Your ceteris paribus, all things aside here, during the pandemic is only going to exacerbate all those problems with the young team, with the roster turnover. At the same time, though, this happened in 2014, 2015 season when Marcus Foster torpedoed the program. Happened again last year with Cartier Jada. That's unacceptable in my mind. But
Yeah.
Gene Taylor's not going to do anything about that. He's if there was a time to let Bruce Weber go, it was last year, right?
Yeah, it's just tricky because, again, I think a lot of it too is like, who can you get right now? Who do you have the money for? Who, will be excited for? And I just think it's tricky. Bruce Weber is a hard coach to move on from because he does have those career highlights that are pretty good. And if you make the wrong hire after a guy like Bruce Weber, that can really set your program back. Now, the good news is it's pretty easy to build put two good recruiting classes together in a basketball program, and all of a sudden you have a great team. So the good news is it's kind of easy to recruit or get your way out of that, even if you do make a bad hire after that. But, I think it would be hard to fire him this year. And, again, I'm not the biggest Bruce Weber guy. I think normally his defenses are pretty good. Normally his offenses are archaic, and they struggle horribly whenever Kansas throws even a basic zone at them. So, I think Bruce Weber is what he is. He develops talent at a pretty good level, doesn't necessarily recruit it at a great level, but he has a pretty good recruiting class from this last year. And his teams come together. And, at the end of the year, they've had some really, impressive moments, either in the league or, what they did in the NCAA tournament that one year. So, I don't know. I'm not the biggest Bruce Weber guy. I also don't think he's terrible. I think he's an okay, solid coach, and there's nothing wrong with keeping him around a couple more years. But, if you give him this chance, you let him take on this full rebuild where you bottom out and then try to build it up, and in a couple years it hasn't turned around, then I do think you have to make a change, and then I think it becomes pretty obvious it's time to move on.
Yeah, he's going up against some of the best coaches in America, so
yeah.
It's tough to be harsh on him. But at the same time, you're Kansas State, right? You can't get those top-rated recruits every season. You're going to go up. You're going to have your Berries and Deans and Cams. They're going to leave. You're going to go back down a little bit. That's fine. That's natural. Didn't expect them to go this far down.
Yeah.
Moving forward in the season, they're going to have 2 games against Kansas, one home, one away. Let's just say a spread, man. What would you put that at? 20?
Well, here's the thing.
We'll go 15. We'll go 15.
Yeah, I put the Baylor spread on our TV show. I believe I made us move it to 24.5. And the reason I picked that high, and the spread was like 19 or something, and it was never going to be that high, but that was more of an indication of maybe the gap in talent, the gap in veterans, the gap in all these things. Kansas and Kansas State, excuse me, have similar, they're relying on youth. Kansas State is relying on way more newcomers, way more youth, but it's similar in terms of this is the stage 1, whereas Baylor is this is the final stage. So I don't necessarily think it would be a 25-point blowout or anything like that. Yeah, I think,
I'll take it if it's less than 25, man.
14.5 in Manhattan and 18.5, 19.5 in Lawrence. And I don't know. I don't think that's crazy. But if you told me both games were closer than that, if you told me both games were decided by 7 to 15 points, I wouldn't be shocked. I would say, okay, that makes sense. I would assume Kansas won both games. I don't know, maybe 12.5 in Manhattan, 16.5 in Lawrence. That probably sounds about right to me.
I'm not saying that K-State's going to beat KU. I'm not saying that at all. But I think K-State's going to pick up a win, maybe 2 wins, against a team that they're not supposed to beat simply because, if you look at the scouting report, you watch their film, you're going to be like, what? This team? We got to play this team? I'm not even going to show up. So I think they got a chance to, catch someone off guard, catch someone on cruise control later in the season. Last question for you, man, before we let you go. Moving forward in the Big 12, what's going to be the biggest surprise to fans here? Is it going to be what team is going to surge and have a late season push? Is it Kansas?
I don't know. It could be. I think the biggest surprise will probably be for a lot of people when Baylor and Texas are both in the Elite 8 this year, and people look around there. Oh, wow, I guess they really were that good, because as good as Baylor is, I mean, what percent of people do you think have watched a full Baylor basketball game? What percent of even college basketball fans is
not many?
I mean, yeah. I mean, maybe they've watched some when they've been in the top 10 matchup or something, but I still think like people don't understand how good this Baylor team is unless they're really watching. And the casual fans who see this team for the first time in March, like they are going to be stunned by how good this Baylor team is, how complete it is, how veteran, how athletic, how talented, how versatile, the defenders, everything. I mean, I was thinking about this the other day. Mark Vital is averaging like 5 points and 5 rebounds per game. And it's like universally agreed he's having a bad year. And like, that's a dude that he could start on a national championship team, like any national championship team from like the last 20 years. Like he's an insanely good glue guy, athlete, versatile. He has the right attitude, the kind of fiery competitive stuff that you want. And like, that's like the bad guy, you know, the guy who's having the bad year for them is this dude that every single coach in America would beg to have on their team, you know, if he was transferring, and, you know, every single coach would come calling. So yeah, I think that'll be it. I just think it'll be the Big 12 will have a great showing in March this year. I guess you can clip this for when every Big 12 team goes out in the first weekend. It'll be funny, but I think this will be a great year for the Big 12 in the NCAA tournament.
Knock on whatever this desk is made out of, man. I'll be honest. I have a bad feeling in my gut about Baylor just because Scott Drew, love him. He's a great guy, great coach. He struggled in March, man. And Shaka Smart, I don't have a ton of faith in him, but I sure hope you're right, man. I hope they can get it done.
I think the talent is too much this time.
Yeah.
Shaka only been out of the first weekend of the NCAA tournament once, but I think this will be another year that he does that.
Well, when he gets out, he goes pretty far, right?
Yeah.
Scott Chasen from Fog.net. Scott, we appreciate you hopping on with us. If you're from Go Powercat, you've got access to Fog.net and everything he does there with the 24/7 Sports umbrella. Be sure to go check him out and everything he does. Scott, once again, man, appreciate it. Thank you so much, man.
Thanks for having me.
Once again, Scott Chasen from Fog.net. Like I mentioned, if you've got a membership to GoPowerCat.com, you're a VIP member, you got access to everything that Scott does. And if you listen to this podcast, not only does he know a lot about KU, but he knows quite a bit about K-State and the rest of the Big 12 as well. If you're not a member, at GoPowerCat.com, you can get your first month if you're a new member for just $1. No reason not to sign up. Ryan Wallace just put up a great article about Skylar Thompson returning for the Wildcats next season. Lots of stuff going on. Basketball season, as much as K-State is struggling, it's in full swing, so be sure to sign up if you're not already. Be sure to follow us on Twitter as well at 10 of 12 Podcast. But other than that, I'm Ryan Gilbert, and we'll catch you next week, everyone.